Okay, I'm one of the many who couldn't even bring myself to vote Labor last year. So I'm actually quite amazed that a lot of what I've got to say overlaps with what James Parnell said this morning and some of what Tim just said. And I do have my own take on it, so please hang around. How's the microphone? It sounds weird. Is that better? Does that sound right? Okay, I'll just go straight to the point of what I would like to see, as a disillusioned Labor supporter, what I would like to see the ALP stand for. And essentially it's a renewal of the fundamentals of social democracy, which is not a surprise. But I want to put the emphasis on the democracy. Now, I'm well aware that these days people talk about democracy is a lot of empty ideological claptrap. But I want to put the argument that in fact is a problem to which, if you really understand social democracy, we have the solution. I think what's been lost in the ideological shift of the last 30 years is an understanding of social democracy is actually the democratic movement of late modernity, and I'll try and explain why. I'll start with an observation about the present. Now, since the financial meltdown of 2008, I've been really struck by how incredibly radical, high-profile economists have come. Now, admittedly, most of these are in the US, and the picture in the US is very clear, but what they're saying actually is an analysis of the Western world generally. So when I read a former chief economist of the IMF, Simon Johnson, say that America is ruled by an oligarchy of the crony capitalism of kind that you find in emerging economies, I was gobsmacked. But then I read the Harvard economist Paul Krugman describing it as a kleptocracy, meaning a country in which the state organises theft by the rich from the poor. Then there was James Galbraith talking about predator states, states whose actual function is to transform public goods, public money into private wealth. And there's a long story there, obviously, about privatisation and how it works. And probably most people here know about Joseph Stiglitz, who's former president of the World Bank, who talks about the rule of the 1% for the 1%. And the list goes on. Now, these people are no radicals, but their analysis is actually to the left of Lenin's. And the reason I'm starting like this is that I want to put the question, why is it that social democratic political parties and progressive politicians can't or won't say anything like this? Why is there this huge gulf between the economists and the politicians, especially given that a large section of the public would endorse what the economists say, that it's pretty obvious, it's ruled by the rich. Okay, now, I'll leave aside the very obvious answer that social democratic parties have themselves been part of the corruption and give an answer that applies to the non-corrupt people in social democratic parties like the people here. And I think the answer here is more ideological. I think there's a deep confusion about what it's appropriate for governments to do. And without some clear idea of what the role of government is, it's hard to identify the disaster in what governments actually have been doing. So I think what we've got is a real confusion about the nature of politics itself. Now, James Galbraith made an observation that was very illuminating to me about the function of ideology. And what he said was that ideologies work not really to direct the behaviour of the people who espouse it, because they live up to it when they feel like it and drop it when they feel like it. As we all know about the Howard era and small government and lack of interference in people's lives and the draconian measures that were brought in terms of surveillance, we know that. So what Galbraith says is that the success of an ideology is measured by the extent to which it constrains the opposition. And ideologically, social democrats are in opposition even when they're in government. And what they're constrained by, I think, is the neoliberal ideology of small government, the idea that government itself is suspect and the less of it, the better. So if you go to the Liberal Party website, the very first thing you meet is this really confident assertion. We believe in lean government that doesn't interfere in people's lives. If you go to the Labor Party's website, you won't find anything analogous about the role of government. But everything it does say about government is a defensive reaction to the neoliberal idea. The Labor Party platform talks about government as market failure and safety nets. And it's not only in the official platform. Julia Gillard said a couple of weeks ago, we've all moved beyond big government. And, I think it's obvious that the coming tough budget is about fear of accusation of big government, much more than it's about the economic requirements of Australia. Now, in what people are now calling the golden age of social democracy, this is my looking back bit, the post-war period, 1945 until the late 70s, it was the other way around. Social democratic ideas controlled the agenda, and it was conservatives who were on the defensive, even when they were in government. Now, what I think is important about social democracy is that it's a positive conception of government as parliamentary democracy and the welfare state. But no one these days, except James Parnell is the first I've heard for a long time, will dare talk about the welfare state. We think that the welfare part means welfare dependency, and the state part means wasteful bureaucracy and Stalinist totalitarianism. But what the welfare state really means is just a public infrastructure of health, education and social security. And that public sphere was never conceived as a sort of a fill-in for market failure, but it was thought of as a condition of meaningful democracy. Now, Tony Jute is one of the rare public intellectuals of my awful baby boomer generation, and in his deathbed appeal to the next generation, he explains why social democracy is necessary for democracy. It's a book called Ill Fares the Land, which is sort of creating a lot of interest around the place and, in my view, should be part of the social democratic canon. Now, what he does, he quotes, looks back on this post-war period in a different way than we usually do. Mostly, we think of this post-war period as John Howard's white picket fence and a time when women were in the home, gays were in the closet, and Aborigines were in reserves. And mostly we think of the government of that time in terms of, yes, minister and inevitably expanding bureaucracy. And my generation is very much responsible for seeing it this way. But certainly the post-war period was all those things, but there were other things as well that were unappreciated. Now, Jute's very simple main point is that back in the days before private wealth meant public squalor, which a lot of people here wouldn't remember, most people made use of and were prepared to be taxed for public goods. Everyone used public education, public health, public transport, and expected social security if they were temporarily out of work and in their old age. And his argument is just very simple, that this preparedness to find your own well-being in contributing to the well-being of others, as well as giving you the shared experience of a sphere where you all actually connect, it made for a real sense of community and nation. And in his terms, that made democracy comparatively much more meaningful than it is today. Now, there's another book that I'd like to recommend, which I think should be part of the social democratic canon. It's a more theoretical book by a woman called Sherry Berman, and it's called The Primacy of Politics. And she takes the argument further. She also thinks the post-war period was the culmination of the social democratic project and proof that social democracy works. But her emphasis that fundamentally social democracy is a project of faith in parliamentary democracy. As she sees it, social democracy is a continuation of liberalism as well as Labourism because it extends parliamentary democracy to the economy. And the reason for that is to rein in the anti-egalitarian and irresponsible tendencies of capitalism. So historically, it was precisely with respect to parliamentary democracy that the line was drawn between social democrats on the one hand and revolutionary Marxist socialists on the other, and revolutionary Marxist socialists and fascists on the other. Now, neoliberal ideology has had enormous success in identifying the welfare state as a kind of totalitarianism in waiting. And in doing so, it's obliterated this very, very important part of the history of social democracy. So my point is simple. It's that what neoliberals dismiss as big government is actually the extension of democracy. And what neoliberalism has achieved is the shrinking of democracy. And I think that is the fundamental background to the trivialisation of politics that disturbs most of us here. Small government means that we don't really think governments should do much, and so politics has to be trivial. The absolute brilliance of neoliberalism as an ideology was to turn the understanding of democracy upside down. Like when I went to school, we were taught that Australia was a free country because it was a parliamentary democracy. And that might have been, in some sense, a load of crap, but there was really something important in it, that governments were thought to be good things if they were democratic. Now, 30 years ago, governments became bad things and the market became the domain of freedom. So really what I want to say, at the level of the argument, at the abstract level of the argument, it's all too easy to turn things around again, to go off the defensive and on the offensive. Small government is patently not a guarantee of freedom. As the economists I began with demonstrate, it's basically ruled by oligarchy and an obscene polarisation of wealth. Moreover, the problems, the basic problems in front of us, economic instability, climate change, social fragmentation, these are problems which can't be dealt with local community action alone, however important that is. These are problems that require government. And the only kind of government which is valuable, which is tolerable, is parliamentary democracy. Now, the actual argument is so much on the social democratic side. The only task, I think, is to get the ideas across and start selling them.